To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. We couldn't do any of this without you. To support the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out a little more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, hold reading or discussion groups, pick up copies of Health Communism and A Short History of Trans Misogyny at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Artie Vierkant.
Hello.
And Jules Gill-Peterson.
Hello.
And the three of us are going to discuss a recent article titled, "Are Colleges Getting Disability Accommodations All Wrong?" by Alan Levinovitz, which was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Basically, the core critique of the article is rooted in the idea that accommodations are being overused, abused, and wasted, which, according to the author, leads to overwhelmed faculty, a misallocation of resources, and compromised academic standards. Levinovitz argues that colleges and universities are being forced to bend too far to accommodate those claiming disability, benefiting students that the author does not see as authentically disabled, while disadvantaging so-called actually disabled students. Quite ironically, with little cited evidence to back this up, the article claims that accommodations themselves often lack sound empirical backing and suggests that without imposing further restrictions, higher education will exacerbate inequalities, ill-prepare disabled students for the real world, and unfairly benefit students who, in the author's view, are cheats and fakes manipulating the system for undeserved accommodations. The article is absolutely filled with harmful and negative tropes and stereotypes about disability. It relies on classic frames that Artie and I have written about at length in Health Communism, such as the idea of waste, fraud, and abuse, the debt and eugenic burden, the worker surplus binary, the notion that accommodations are a kind of currency, and of course, the individualization of what is actually a systemic problem of higher education, blaming this instead on disabled students and those who claim disability without, in the author's view, enough proof. Now, before we start, it's also worth mentioning just a little bit about the author, Alan Levinovitz, who has absolutely no expertise in this area. He is a professor of religion at James Madison University with a specialty in Chinese religious traditions. He wrote a book called The Gluten Lie, which appears to be basically a diet book that leverages similar arguments like the one in the article that we're talking about today, but to make scarcity-minded claims against people who he feels are faking allergies they don't have and harming people as a result. The idea that all the world is permanently zero-sum and that anything one group gets in terms of accommodations must always be taken away from another is pretty consistent in his work and key to the piece that we're going to be talking about today. In part, we're also talking about this article not just because the argument is exceptionally bad, but also because Levinovitz has spent his time since the Chronicle article's publication arguing with actual disability scholars and disabled people about the merits of the piece and punching down. So the three of us are going to do a close read of this piece and explore why the Chronicle article's argument serves as a textbook example of how liberalism and ableism work together to form a core dynamic of our political economy, which marks not just disabled people, but anyone whose existence falls in any way outside the bounds of capitalist standards and ideals as burdensome and disposable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you said, this is just sort of a very good example of a type of guy, which is, I think, the sort of austerity champion.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get into that. I think there's a lot to talk about with this. So I think it would be good just to, from the jump, start right into our close read.
Yeah.
As B said just earlier, this is from the Chronicle of Higher Education. It came out September 25th, and it is called "Are Colleges Getting Disability Accommodations All Wrong?" with the subhead, "Higher Ed's Maximally Inclusive Approach Hurts Those It Attempts to Help." It begins. Disability accommodations in American higher education are skyrocketing. In the past decade, the proportion of colleges with more than 10% of students registered as disabled has quintupled, and accommodation requests have followed the same pattern. Despite increased staff and resources, disability service providers are overwhelmed, and it's common for a single staff member to be tasked with serving 500 students. Faculty are also reporting increased workloads as they find themselves continually adjusting teaching and assessment practices.
I mean, it was hard not to jump in right away with the first sentence, because what we see here, of course, is the classic problem of the fact that disabled people did not have access to higher education until the 70s, after significant struggle and protest and legal cases and changes to the law. And as we've seen throughout the years, disability has become like a larger, more fluid concept to actually reflect how it exists in real life. But of course, this article frames this increase not as like, reality, but a suspicious problem, right? This is a worrying kind of increase that is really just throughout the entire core of this piece, something that, again, is framing the problem of maybe just a university administration itself as something that disabled people and those who are contributing to this suspicious increase are foisting on the university as a kind of burdensome imposition.
Yeah, I think the whole piece, as we'll get into it, kind of track the twists and turns of this. It, as you said earlier, Artie, it's an austerity argument. And it's, the presumption here, of course, is that this increase is a problem because there are, not just because presently, resources might not be inadequate, but because it's fundamentally impossible to provide adequate resources on campuses. It's a neoliberal argument in its aim, right? This is basically a deregulation piece that wants to argue for the dismantling, or not the total dismantling, right? But it's sort of a pretext or a prerequisite argument. It's going to want to claim that we should shrink disability accommodation services on campus, in part by establishing much more narrow criteria and so on. But the reason why that needs to be done, although I think the thing we'll see the author is really worried about, he says, is, that harm is being done or that the wrong thing is happening. It's also pretty nakedly or obviously just a claim to want to reduce regulation and to spend less, resources on students and, just to basically continue in a long, long march of reducing university funding and making, schools have to operate on less and less when it comes to actually provisioning things that are useful to students instead of capital projects, et cetera. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah. The whole setup of this article reminds me of the genre of tweet that you see from time to time where sort of a conservative boomer says something like, when I was growing up back in my day, we didn't have kids with gluten allergies in class, or we didn't have neurodivergent or trans kids in class, which is, again, as B mentioned specifically with there were no neurodivergent or disabled kids in my classroom. It's like, yeah, there was even more so than today, a much more complete structural exclusion of disabled people from settings like education settings, higher and otherwise, right?
Yeah, high school too was like a big accomplishment for a disabled person pre-1980s.
I also just want to note how I do think that this first paragraph is so key because in so many ways, as B kind of said as well, we could almost just stop here because in this paragraph you have, okay, yes, this is a population that's increasing. We can imagine that this is increasing perhaps because, again, until around the 80s, a lot of these people would have otherwise been in fucking asylums, but also because there have been strides that higher education institutions have taken to try to start at least to become more accessible to disabled students, right? Clearly, they're very incomplete. But then again, we see even if we take at face value the things that the author is saying in this paragraph, he's saying, okay, quote, the proportion of colleges with more than 10% of students registered as disabled has quintupled and accommodation requests have followed the same pattern. So, all right, so more disabled students
means
more accommodation requests.
Right.
So what's the problem? Well, the problem then to him next is then staff and faculty are overwhelmed with, sometimes having one staff member to 500 students. Okay, is that the disabled students' problem?
Yes, but this big brain boy says if we simply just remove the disabled students, then we don't have a problem, right? Because this is not well known, like part of the origin of the disability rights movement actually is like specifically around demands for access to education. During the early 20th century, it was very rare for disabled people to have anything, beyond a high school education. And those who had a high school education were often doing correspondence education, right? Getting their degree by mail, basically. when the polio generation sort of increases the visibility and awareness of disability and also kind of changes the demographics of who is disabled, what we see is an increase in correspondence school and many more disabled people getting a high school education than before. Previously, as Artie was saying, a lot of disabled people, lived their entire lives in asylums, fully separated from mainstream society, and so would receive whatever education was available in that institution if there was any. Oftentimes it was like basket weaving or small menial tasks and light factory work, farming, things like that.
Yeah.
But what happens in the 1980s after Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is enforced finally is that disabled people have leverage to basically petition colleges to give them access to accessible housing, allowing them to not just participate in college from correspondence, but actually be part of campus life, be on the campus, and be participating in classes. So this is like a very recent phenomenon that disabled people are even part of higher education and part of the physical building itself and classes, right? So he's taking what is essentially like one of the most marginal but important wins of the entire history of disability and saying that that itself is the problem that is creating an undue burdensome workload.
Right.
And that itself needs to be undone in order to alleviate the workload, right? I mean, it's just, this argument has like zero merits to it when you really lay it out that way. But this is important to understand. This is really the key point that he's making here.
But also, again, in being this austerity argument, it is perfectly teed up to sort of sow distrust of disabled students among faculty, among staff, among other students, because when you look at it, I mean, the thing that he alludes to, faculty being overwhelmed or staff being overwhelmed, for example, I mean, okay, that's a true phenomenon, but that's a much broader phenomenon than just because of disability accommodations. It has much more to do with the hollowing out of the university for increased rent seeking and the devaluation of academic labor for the vast majority of disciplines, I think, especially the humanities and the arts, right? Where like, just like across working class industries, pay isn't rising with inflation. And in the case of faculty, more and more administrative tasks are being foisted on them to, suck up much more of their time. I mean, it's just, this isn't my fight in particular, but there's a lot, I think, that you can read about it. And like usual, the culprit is actually more the political economy and what decisions have been made about the university rather than this, atrocious claim that this burden is because of disabled students being the cause of faculty's quote unquote increased workloads.
Right. Like the exploitation of the university is being recast as disabled people exploiting university workers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to continue with the article. I know that was a lot on just the first paragraph, but there's a lot more that we will get in.
And the first
today.
paragraph is a lot.
Yeah. Author continues, quote, "Providing an accessible education to everyone is a crucial civil rights issue, one that went unaddressed in this country for far too long. Discrimination against people with disabilities was standard practice until the introduction of legal protections like Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Without these protections, blind students would have no recourse if their community college failed to provide accessible versions of textbooks and library materials, and deaf students participating in online classes would not be entitled to closed captioning. Even with robust laws in place, disabilities are frequently missed or dismissed, a problem compounded by racial and socioeconomic disparities. Concern about the validity of surging accommodation requests may therefore seem misplaced." To a certain extent, the trend is a positive development. So he's kind of, starting to acknowledge some of the things that we're saying, but again, his conclusion is far from taking these things seriously. These are more caveats, I think, and defensiveness from him. Again, he says, to a certain extent, the trend is a positive development, the product of increased awareness, better screening practices, and less institutional discrimination. Citation needed. "We should worry about students' rising rates of mental health disorders, many disability advocates say, not the willingness of colleges to accommodate them."
That also needs a fucking citation because who the fuck were you talking to? One thing I just want to point out really quickly is that you can tell how poorly versed he is in disability history by the way that he, names the legal protections of Section 504 and specifically ties it to the year that it's passed, not the year that it's enacted. It's not enacted until disabled people occupy a federal building for over a month in San Francisco in 1977. So immediately what happens when the Rehabilitation Act passes, and listen to our episode on Section 504 for like a very detailed 2-hour plus history of this, is that essentially the Department of Education, government, the average kind of like worker within the government in the housing, education, and welfare department is basically like, oh shit, this is going to cost way too much money. We can't implement it. Because the thing that Section 504 does is it says that if you refuse to make your facility accessible, then you will not receive federal funding. As a punishment, right? And so this is the beginning of the disability protest movement, mostly because it's like immediately the idea of burden and cost is a part of it, right? So the way that he sort of lays this out is obviously incredibly disingenuous. He's saying, here are all these caveats, and I acknowledge the history, and I understand that this is progress. But of course, this kind of bigger problem argument that arises is, well, actually, the way to handle this is by restricting access to accommodations, right? Not by questioning the sort of role of the university, the function of law. This is the classic way of sort of seeing legal protections as something that disabled people are entitled to, but deserve punishment for ultimately, because this is a kind of backlash framing that we're going to see throughout the rest of the piece.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. Like the overall genre here to be is like in the vein of sort of reactionary, centrist kind of thinking that, takes a really, it takes great pains to present its own reasonableness and like commitment to sort of, liberal platitudes as in like the transcendent good value of statutes, like kind of in a decontextualized way, right? And I think one of the reasons that that's so important is not because necessarily the author is like, putting together this true paean or for liberalism, as in like that will be our one true faith, but it's more to then be able to say like, but the implementation has, not followed the positivist ideals that, that go with good governance. And therefore we can, basically where the article is going to take us is to really question, disability and to question disabled people, to want to, get to make a whole bunch of decisions that in the material context that you're just outlining are really just kind of outrageous, right? But they get to be presented as sort of reasonable and rational reactions. And I just think it's always really interesting. The Chronicle as a publication definitely, in this media market in which driving attention is really important to profitability and to advertising, kind of has a history of publishing pieces like this that are so caveated, right? That their own arguments don't internally make sense, right? Like there are enough things in this paragraph and these two paragraphs that are introduced to completely undermine the rest of the piece. But the reason that that's so important, I think, is because it sets up this kind of posturing, this kind of reactionary, like, well, I am the one true believer, right, in Section 504 of the ADA. It's just that I really want to trust, social scientists who have a certain methodology for deciding what is and isn't evidence of efficacy. And, by completely evacuating the actual context of political struggle through which access to higher education was in any way enacted, right? That's sort of the sleight of hand, I think, here. So there's just something really important to me about this form of argument and the way that it sort of tries to make, I don't know, it's just like when you also acknowledge like devastating critiques of your own position, then somehow that's supposed to be like you're not on the hook for them. But I just think that's such an interesting turn in argumentative writing.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Like disability rights protections, super important. Love it. Can we trust them though?
But it's exactly that, right? Love them. They're so important, but we should absolutely not have them or not have as many of them. Like, hold on a second.
But are we overdoing it?
Yeah. You wouldn't want too much of a good thing, Artie.
Which, true to form, the very next paragraph begins with, however, however, a suite of acute, well-documented problems with disability accommodations demand attention. The data is clear, for instance, that a significant minority of diagnoses are fraudulent or mistaken.
I mean,
The phrase significant minority is really one to hold on to. That's a really interesting sentence. Again, it's like, excuse me, hold on. A significant minority?
It's a significant one, though.
That's
Jules.
supposed to stress
There
me?
is significance to this minority.
these
I know
are well
about scale.
documented. It demands attention. It's a significant minority.
But also just...
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.